Well, Christmas is over and New Year's Eve is running towards us like that thing from Hellraiser in the hospital scene. And I'm sick, so that's great. Anyway, that means I'll be making my top 25 scariest stories of the year video soon, so I need your help picking out those stories. If you would, in the comments below, tell me the title of the story you liked the most this year. It has to be a story I narrated this year. And please provide a link to the video you're referring to. A lot of folks think because I read these stories, I'll remember what story or video you're talking about. That's not how it works. The more I read, the more I forget, and I can't keep up with it. Anyway, I appreciate the help, and I can't wait to see what you guys like the most. Until then, enjoy this episode. It's a bunch of new spooky tales that'll be great for anyone's New Year's Eve. Bring in the new year terrified and shaking in the corner. Don't forget, you can always send me your stories at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. I Don't Want to Believe. A 4chan story from Anonymous. A while back, I asked a friend of mine if he knows anyone who had access to some tools I needed to finish a project. Says sure, he knows a guy from work that would be happy to help me out. Turns out this guy was interested in the same kind of art, but warns me that he's a bit off. I drive the friend to work one day and he introduces me to his friend. This guy seems really distant and withdrawn. He shakes my hand and we chat a bit. He seems really interested in the woodwork I was doing. We started talking about sculptures and things like that for a little while, things we'd learned and tools we used. He warms up to me a bit, so I ask him if it would be alright if I checked out some of his stuff. He gets hesitant, but he agrees, kind of like when you're trying to come up with an excuse but can't. He tells me I can swing by that night, that we can chat over a few beers. Okay, sure, I say. Later that night, I get a call. It's the same guy, but he sounds a bit shaken up. Says things are a bit chaotic at home and right now is not a good time. He says he'll call me sometime when things are better. Alright, sure man, I replied. A couple of weeks go by. The guy calls me one afternoon and says things have settled down. Says it'd be fun if I brought over some of my works as well. We could compare and discuss and all that. Sure thing, I replied. So I start to head over. And I notice that the guy lives in the middle of freaking nowhere in the woods. I had to call him up just to make sure I was finding his house okay. It was at the end of a long driveway, a beautiful acre or so of land. The driveway is littered with trees and his house was actually quite nice. As I come up the driveway, something immediately strikes me as weird about the trees that I was passing. They all had, well, faces carved into them facing the driveway. Twisted, pained faces. I didn't think much of it. I make morbid stuff myself. In fact, I was kind of impressed about it. The amount of detail on them was staggering. Looking out into the tree line of the property, every single tree had a pained face carved into it, facing the house. It was almost like the woods were watching you wherever you were. This even creeped me out. Looking out was like seeing 100 or so faces staring at you, just crying out, as if they wanted your attention. Anyway, I pull up to the guy's house and walk to his door, giving it a knock. He answers with a beer in his hand, and he has a way friendlier demeanor than before. He helps me carry some of my stuff in and shows me around the place. Seems pretty cool. I begin to notice each room has one of those same darned faces hanging from the doorframe though. The more of them I saw, the more I felt sick. Up close, the faces were even more detailed than I'd imagined. Almost surreal. I asked him what his focus on the faces was about, and the guy immediately tensed up and dodged the question. Upon entering his workshop, which was freaking sweet by the way, he seemed to have other interests besides creepy faces. There were entire 7-foot sculptures of women, men, animals, all really well done, and one with a tarp in the back just chillin' there. He says he's not done with that one yet, so don't bother. It was right in front of a door that I think led to another room. So we began working on stuff together, trading stories and times we had accidentally injured ourselves. Suddenly, subjects changed. Out of nowhere, he asks me what I think about God. I'm straight up with him, tell him that I'm not very religious, but I don't rule anything out. He starts getting a little bit loud, saying that God is a blatant lie, that he was told so. Well, who told you that? I asked. He went silent for a moment, then abruptly asked me if I believed in spirits. I gave him the same kind of answer as before. I don't know, but maybe it's possible. He starts looking around the room, as if seeing if anyone is around, and then his voice goes soft. Then he starts whispering. I see things in the woods. At dusk, I see shadows. Sometimes they whisper from the trees, and I hear them. What the hell? Obviously, this guy is mentally disturbed, but I egg him on, ask him what they tell him. They say God is a lie. Only thing after death is darkness. They laugh at me, and they leave dead animals at the tree line. I am beyond creeped out at this point. He said for a while they visited him at night, and each face carving represented a different spirit that had visited him. Says that they can't stand looking at themselves in death, so they don't step within the tree line. That's why he has the entire thing carved out. I'm pretty quiet at this point. I hadn't had goosebumps this bad since I was a child. Chills were running up my spine. He continued. They talk to me from the tree line at night. They try to get me to leave my house. I eagerly try to change the subject. He looks down and just keeps talking. He's pale as a sheet and was obviously genuinely terrified. He even looks like he's about to cry. You're the only person I've told now. I'm so sorry. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do anymore. I try my best to awkwardly console the stranger. The guy actually kind of starts to break down. I seriously think he needs help, but it's not my place to give it to him. I regrettingly ask him why he's afraid. The faces don't work anymore. 2 weeks ago, I found something in my living room. What do you mean? He walks over to the tarped sculpture and pulls the tarp off to reveal something that is not a sculpture. It's the most terrible thing I've ever seen. It hardly resembled a human being. It was horrifying to have imagined this guy seeing it standing in his living room. Shortly after that, there was a loud bang on the wall to my right. I nearly jumped out of my skin. But the guy didn't even flinch. There was another bang, then it continued on and on continuously, like hail hitting a tin roof. The guy screams, "Stop it!" And it does. After that, I grabbed my stuff and told the guy I was sorry. I had to leave. As I'm leaving his house and driveway, I looked into the rearview mirror. The tree line was darker than I'd ever seen. The guy calls me a week later and apologizes. Says he was just silly and everything was okay. The friend says the guy quit though, and we never heard from him again. A 4chan story from DesertRat. I'd like to tell you a story in regards to some of my recent adventures. There are no skeletons in closets, dinosaurs walking, or trips to Bel Air. I'm not a writer by any means. Whether you think this story is paranormal, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or man-made, I'll leave that up to you, as I can't decide for myself. I like to fancy myself as a survivalist, a prepper for some of you. I live in Nevada, about an hour outside of Las Vegas. For those of you that don't know, a good 90% of Nevada is government or military-owned land. A lot of it is free to roam, though. The only areas that you really shouldn't venture to are well fenced and clearly marked for good reasons. There are many still active radioactive sites, as well as government testing facilities, bombing ranges, and other things of that nature. They really aren't that exciting, to be quite honest, and usually only have some concrete foundations or target shacks on them, and are probably hazardous to your health or safety at that. The sites that aren't are usually full of manned military bases where they cock about with drones. Now, I've never been one to believe in paranormal phenomenon. At best, I acknowledge that our government has several high-tech projects that they keep veiled. But what I experienced, it's really made me question my beliefs. This story started about a month ago, around a warm spring night. It starts warming up pretty early here. If you're getting snow, it's probably getting 80 degrees here. I had vacation time I'd yet to cash in, and it was nearing the point of expiration, so I took it, not really having any plans for it. Once I had my 2 weeks off, I had no idea what to do with it. I did, however, take some of my savings and cashed in on an IR laser for my rifle and a night vision monocular headset. The first night of my vacation, I felt somewhat restless. I started up a Minecraft server, played around for a bit, but I felt unsatisfied. I've always had trouble sitting still too long, knowing there's nothing to be productive with. So my mind goes racing, coming up with hundreds of ideas for projects. I finally settled on the idea of camping. Unfortunately, most of my friends were busy with the drudgery of work, and no one I knew was willing to get away for the week. It dawned on me that I'd never tried camping for a lengthy period of time alone. But that's for good reason. The desert is a nasty place to get stranded, and death is a very real possibility here. If something went wrong and you were on your own, it could be bad. Between dehydration, broken bones, and rattlesnakes, you definitely have to be careful. The only thing I could really think of to combat this would be to take along my 5-watt ham radio and research the closest repeaters to different choice areas. That way I could call for help if things went south. And I would take my Yugo M76 just in case. After doing some research and quick site planning, I settled on an area I honestly didn't know very well. But it looked promising. It had several abandoned silver mines, washes for shelter, and a lot of wildlife to watch or take potshots at. Of course, if anyone from PETA got wind of my ventures, they would have an absolute crap storm over the number of jackrabbits and coyotes I've laid waste to. So once settling on my location, I began to pack. This wasn't difficult, as I always kept my bug-out bag ready in my closet, and decided it was a good time to cycle out my old inventory. This time was a bit different, though. I decided to bring a few more electronics with me than usual, including the ham radio, my night vision monocular, and a solar charger just in case. I decided to leave my cell phone behind, relying on a good old-fashioned map and compass for navigation. From an early age in Boy Scouts, I've known how to navigate the old-fashioned way, and decided I'd give my rusty skills a bit of a test, see how well I remembered the UTM coordinate system. The electronics were for some nighttime fun and emergencies only. I woke up at 3:30 a.m., day 2 of my vacation. I was excited as hell and ready to head out. I decided to load up on crap before hitting the highway and stopped and got some coffee and donuts, looking like some ridiculous commando on a dirt bike. After getting my sweet black nectar and a load of simple carbs, I headed off. The weather was great, and the wind rushing over my face felt wonderful. As I got a few miles away from the turnoff, I remembered there was an Indian gas station fairly close to the exit as well. The Indian reservation boundaries are an odd shape, and for about a mile the highway went right through the middle of it, offering anyone who stopped in tax-free gasoline. I stopped in after topping off my tank, and the cashier asked where I was off to. I told her where I was going, that I was planning to do some camping. She mentioned the old Air Force base a few miles away had been doing some testing, and warned me not to get too close to their target range. This is definitely something to take seriously, as they do drop live ordnance. I thanked her for the advice and headed out. It was early morning still, and I continued to enjoy the feeling of wind on my face. It's liberating, being able to break free of any social obligations for a while. I made it to the turnoff area, where it was all dirt and gravel from there on. I performed a quick test of the ham radio, set the repeater offset, and verified the reception was clear. The dial tone registered, and I got a familiar weather forecast for the day. I was ready to start my camping trip. I headed down a dirt trail and soldiered on through the bumps and washes. My bike frantically kicked up dust and rocks until I finally reached a couple of fork points in the trail. By then, I couldn't quite remember which direction I was supposed to go, as I'd only been in the area once before with a friend, and he had been driving at the time. I looked at my map and got what I believed to be a good bearing, so I headed off down the trail. Now, when I say trail, these are more like gravel roads that sometimes end, or they bring you to a military base encampment, or some of the other small encampments around the state, or wildlife preserves, or even BLM land and campsites. Accidentally venturing into a military encampment isn't a big deal. They'll usually just turn you around or wave you off. So I wasn't too horribly concerned about a run-in with anyone, unless you're up near Groom Lake, but that's a different story. After driving down this particular trail for a while, I realized I was lost. None of the landscape looked familiar, and I'd traveled a good 25 miles before reaching anything that looked like a decent campsite. I had packed plenty of water and food, so I wasn't too worried. I also remembered the way in which I came, so that wasn't really an issue either. At that point, I just decided it was adventure time, so I drove for a while, until I found a campsite I decided was suitable for a short stay. I ended up settling at the base of a mountain near a dried-up wash. It was a pretty nice area, and there were quite a few Joshua trees and trenches to set up in for some decent afternoon shade. It wasn't rainy season, so the threat of a flash flood taking me out wasn't really a concern either. After getting set up, I threw on my camel pack, grabbed my rifle, and filled my flask with a bit of vodka for fun. I was my own man now, had to answer to nobody. I walked around, heard the familiar sounds of cicada, whatever you want to call them, and headed towards another dry wash near the base of the mountain. After walking for a bit, I quickly became bored and took a swig of vodka. Sometimes it can take a bit to just detach from normal life and relax. I decided after my drink it was time to start setting up some targets. I wanted to push my Yugo M76 to its limits. After setting up a few targets, I was good to go. I walked back to my campsite, identifying the local plant life and inspecting oddly shaped rocks. I wasn't really in any hurry. I stirred up a jackrabbit on the way back who was less than happy to see my presence in the valley. I shouldered my rifle to take a pot shot at it, and then noticed something in the corner of the scope. I adjusted the zoom and got a closer look. There was no mistaking it. It was a freshly killed coyote. I decided to let our little rabbit friend go for the time being, and I headed over to the coyote carcass. The closer I got to it, the more pungent the air became. The smell of rotting meat was heavy. When I was right next to it, two things struck me as slightly odd. The pelt wasn't completely removed, for one, but what had been was fairly clean. There weren't any missing extremities. Coyotes are considered a nuisance, so you can shoot them freely, but usually grabbing the pelt, tail, or paw is common. And two, it didn't look like there had been any entry or exit wounds from a bullet. Being a bit confused, I wrote it off as a sloppy hunter who had found a coyote dead of natural causes and was scamming some farmer offering bounties on hides. Sometimes cannibalism happens in coyote packs, but it's not very common, and this wasn't what it usually looked like. After that, I made it back to camp. I started a fire, drinking down a shot or two of more liquid courage. I settled on taking pot shots at the targets I set up. I tinkered around, adjusting my scope, trying to take the longest shots I could. I actually managed to make a few accurate shots out to 700 meters, and decided that I'd pushed myself as far as I could in my slightly buzzed state. Yeah, I know, guns plus alcohol is bad. But I wasn't really in a crowded area either, you know? And I was far from smashed. After letting the rifle cool down for a bit, and breaking open one of my MREs, I began cleaning it. After several failed attempts at keeping it 100% dust-free, I gave up. So I just did a quick field cleaning. It may not have passed the white glove test, but it would darn sure work if I needed it to. After a nice 5-star MRE meal, I decided to break out my ham radio and turned it on. I wanted to see if there were any other hams in the area. I scanned the stations, but I didn't really come across anything of interest, save for a few rangers reporting status. I decided I'd do something that you're really not supposed to do, and I started to scan for capped channels. Let me explain. The military operates on MARS capped channels, which have a very high frequency, higher than VHF. You can eavesdrop on them with the right radio modifications, and as long as you don't broadcast, you should be fine. I started scanning these channels and came across a bit of chatter. They didn't seem to have much to say either, except area status reports. After a bit, I started getting bored listening to them all report on 1000s and turned off the radio. As dusk was turning to darkness, I sat for a while, just letting myself go into a trance, staring at the fire. By then, I decided another drink was in order, but then I began to hear a bit of crackling coming from my bag. I grabbed it, thinking some critter or Gila monster got in my bag, and instead I found my radio turned on slightly. I turned it up a bit and realized that the sounds I was hearing were short bursts of what sounded like gunfire over the radio. Intrigued, I turned it up, listening into whatever testing or war games were going on. As I listened to the action, I heard what could only be described as fingernails on a chalkboard, coupled with a blood-curdling scream, and throw in some dying rabbit or something. As I reached for the knob to turn the volume down, I heard a pop, and then silence. My radio had gone out or blown a capacitor, and I was now without any form of communication. I sat there in silence for a moment, wondering if coming out here wasn't the best idea after all. After thinking about it for a moment and a bit of self-reassurance, I decided I was just letting these small, stupid things like the coyote carcass and the radio chatter get to me. For all I knew, it was just some war games being played, and new equipment being tested. I figured it was time to get some sleep, and I'd do a bit more exploring in the morning. I took one more swig and crawled into my tent for a bit of sleep. As I awoke the next day and crawled out of my tent, I felt like death. My back ached, and I was incredibly groggy and slow-moving. I restarted the fire and filled up my mess kit pot with water. I got it boiling while pulling out some instant coffee. That day would be a bit more of riding around and exploring. I glanced at my radio lying next to me and thought, guess I better be careful. After a morning of coffee and MRE eggs and bacon, I grabbed my rifle and headed out to see if I could see any signs of life, or find any old abandoned equipment or buildings. I biked up a natural trail and came over a ridge to a large stretch of open valley and land. Off in the distance, I could see the beginning of a military base's fence. When I saw this, I felt an incredibly sinking feeling in my chest. Whatever was going on last night may very well have been happening just a few miles away. I shook off the feeling and decided that I was just letting my anxiety and imagination get to me. I told myself again that it was only war games, and that some noise was probably getting through the channels. I decided to just avoid the area, so I rode back towards the campsite over the lower mountain ridge. As I turned back, I noticed something off in the distance. On the side of the mountain face, it was what looked like an abandoned silver mine, or a natural cave of sorts. At this point, my curiosity got the better of me. I shook off all my fear I may have once had. I could actually do a bit of exploration now. I rode up to the side, dismounted, grabbed my night vision and rifle, and I peeked inside. I couldn't tell how deep it was, but it seemed more man-made than anything. The rocks looked roughly carved, but I'm not a geologist, so take that as you will. I couldn't smell or hear anything, so I decided to walk in a bit further. I put on my night vision and waited for my eyes to adjust from bright desert sun to darkness. After a second, my eyes adjusted, and I turned on my monocular. There wasn't much to be seen. I walked for a ways, but still no signs of anything that would excite anyone other than a geologist. I could see what looked like a turn a bit further back and decided against going too far in, as I was not experienced in spelunking. That's when something hit me. There is a primal fear everyone has. People debate what it is or how we acquired it as a species. Oh, but it's there. It's a deep feeling of dread, like you're being watched and stalked by something horrific. Chills crawl up your body, and you feel that something just isn't right. Well, I felt this, and I immediately froze. My rifle was in my hand, and I pointed it down into the cave. I couldn't hear anything, nor could I see anything. I then, however, quickly realized what was wrong. The smell. That same pungent smell the coyote carcass was letting off. It seemed too rotten, too pungent, too strong for just a carcass of a coyote. Even in the sun, it just seemed odd, but now I could smell it wafting from the cave. This set off every alarm in my mind, and every ounce of fear in me told me to get out of there. I slowly backed out, shouldering my rifle, pointing it towards the back of that cave. Every rock under my boots sounded 100 times louder, and every breath I took felt as if it echoed throughout the entire cave. As I made it back to the entrance, I turned and bolted for my bike. I started it up and rode back as quickly as possible. I was taking no chances now and decided it was probably best to leave. Dusk was beginning to set in as I rode back. I was contemplating just moving to a new site or calling the trip off 2 days in. I still wasn't sure if any of this meant anything, or if I was simply overreacting, but I knew that something weird was going on. As I rode closer to my campsite, I noticed everything seemed off, as though nothing was how I left it. I was feeling really uneasy now, but I wasn't about to leave my expensive equipment behind. As I got closer, I realized why everything seemed off. My campsite had been raided. My tent was torn, my mess kit was strewn about, the fire pit had been scattered, and my pack had been dumped out. I assessed the damage and realized something. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been taken. I'd simply been vandalized. Even my radio, solar charger, and extra ammo remained. Stuff I was sure would be missing. My decision was made. I was calling it quits tonight. I started packing up my bag and whatever I could scavenge from the ground. That was about the time I noticed something else. There were no sounds at all. No cicada, no crickets, no birds, just complete and deafening silence. As I was packing up, I quickly drained my flask to calm my nerves. Nothing at this point could have changed my mind about leaving. It was quickly getting dark, and even with night vision and a rifle, whatever was out there was obviously screwing with me. It was clear this territory belonged to someone or something else. My hunting trip turned tables on me. As it grew darker, I decided to scan the area first to make sure my surroundings were clear. As I looked around, I couldn't see much more than the familiar desert landscape. As I began to scan the area near the peak of the mountain, I saw something move. It was just visible behind a rocky area. I tried to make out the shape, but it was distorted and hidden by some larger rocks. I stared in that direction for what seemed like hours. Then the figure stood up. To this day, I'll never forget the sheer terror, the fear I felt while looking at this thing. It was as though death and evil itself was staring right at me, and every part of my mind screamed that this cannot be real. The two-legged creature stood as though it was human, but the eyes were huge, just massive blank dark spots in my night vision. No reflection or gleam came from them. I could not distinguish any real features other than what seemed to be a scaly texture. It stood there, looking in my direction, as though it knew I was watching it. Then it did something that nearly made me soil myself. It smiled. It wasn't a normal smile at all. It was a terrible, jagged-toothed, Joker-like grin. I took the safety off my rifle, and I shone the IR laser at it. After a brief pause, I delivered a fatal 8mm round to its head, or so I thought. The shriek that followed was deafening, blood-curdling, and absolutely terrible to hear. It was a scream that went straight into my soul and shattered it to bits. The dying screams of someone getting their head sawn off. No, it was worse than that, because at that point, that would have been comforting. I watched this thing shake and shudder for a moment, and quickly delivered another round in the direction of it. I think I hit its center mass, but couldn't be sure. It began to run, at a pace I'm not even sure my bike could keep up with. It ran down the ridge, not quite in my direction, but too close for comfort. I bolted down into the wash and kept my gun trained in its direction as best as I could while running. I ducked into a small crevice and waited. I could hear grunts and screeches in the distance. At first, they seemed to move closer and then further away. It was difficult to tell where the noises were coming from, but in the pitch dark, I sure as hell wasn't going anywhere that night, not as long as that thing was around. I stayed up all night, crouched in a crevice in the side of the wash, just waiting. My gun was trained at the opening. I was kept awake only by adrenaline. It was the most exhausting and terrifying night of my life. Eventually, dawn broke, and I hadn't heard any signs of the thing. It had been a good few hours since I took the first shot, but I waited until daylight was strong enough to even think about moving from my spot. As the sun rose and the familiar sounds of wildlife returned, I felt safe enough to venture from my spot. Very carefully, I crept out, covered in dust and feeling incredibly drained. I emerged, and I looked around to see if anything was around. There were no signs of whatever the hell that thing was from last night, so I decided to man up, and I headed over to my bike. I didn't even think to grab my equipment. I simply slung my rifle over my shoulder and very reluctantly started my bike, fearing whatever came last night might hear me and come again. After the bike was running for about a minute, and there were no signs of movement, I decided to carefully start heading out. Before that, though, I had a thought. I wondered what may have been left behind where I scored a hit on the thing. I swallowed hard, and I decided to go check it out. Everything seemed clear after all. I drove up the ridge in DEFCON 1, scanning the entire area just to make sure it wasn't watching me or following me. I got up to the rocky area where I first saw it hiding, and I found a nice bit of blood splatter. I quickly grabbed a handful of earth and dried blood, booking it back out of the area. As I was driving down the trail, I started feeling as though I was being watched again, but I only drove faster, never looking back. After I got home, $500 worth of gear left at that campsite, keeping only my rifle and a couple of magazines of ammo, as well as my night goggles, I decided to get the bottom of this. I called up a friend of mine who works for the local university, and I told her the situation. I didn't exactly go into much detail, but I explained that I'd been hunting, and I shot something I wasn't sure of, something that had attacked me. She had me bring her the blood-stained rocks, and I guess she ran some DNA tests on them. A month goes by, and I'm anxious. Eventually, she calls, but basically she says she has no idea what the DNA is, and explained to me it only partially matched a few animals. Here's where everything gets weird. I got a call from, well, I don't really know, to be honest. They referred to my camping and said it was best I forget what I saw that night. Since then, I've also noticed a few people trailing me while driving, and leapfrogging me on a regular basis, trading off following shifts. And that's it, really. I'm not sure where else to go from here. I'm sorry there's not much closure to this story, but now you know as much as I do. Road blockage. From Oh No. I was on a holiday with my family in Tasmania. This is just off the coast of Australia, if you don't know. We had just gotten off of the Spirit of Tasmania, a cruise ship that travels from Melbourne to Devonport. Since we had boarded the ship early in the morning, we arrived at Devonport late at night. As we got off the ship, my wife suggested that we call a cab to our nearest car rental shop, rent a car, then drive ourselves to the hotel. I agreed, so she called up the taxi service, while me and the kids were trying to count how many people in silly jackets we could see. When the cab arrived, we got in and left immediately. It was kind of squished and cramped in the car, and I think my wife thought that the Greek guy driving us was a bit creepy. After about 10 minutes, he dropped us off at the car rental shop. It was dark and a bit eerie there. My wife and I looked around for someone. We had actually called the owner of the store the day before, and he said that if we were to come over, there should be someone there. I remember feeling annoyed then, and furiously calling the owner. When the phone picked up, it wasn't a man's voice like before, but a woman, who I assumed to be his wife. In a matter of seconds, I had her handing the phone to the owner. He said that he'd send someone over shortly, so me and my family had to wait inside a large building, one that kind of looked like an airport. My younger son asked if he could go and get a Mars bar from a nearby vending machine, so I gave him a $2 coin, and he eagerly ran over to get some candy. Soon after, a young woman, probably in her mid-30s, walked into the building with us. We assumed that this was the person the owner was talking about, so my wife and I asked if she worked there. She said she did, with a little sheepishness. She took out a clipboard and my wife filled in some paperwork. Eventually, the employee handed her a key. The employee led us to a small but manageable white car. We bid our goodbyes and drove away. It had been about half an hour. Everyone was asleep except for me. I was driving down a windy road surrounded by trees and grassy fields. I had eventually got to a point of tiredness where I was kind of drifting between being awake and asleep, but I did my best to drive safely. At about 12:34 a.m., I heard a loud thumping sound coming from somewhere to my left. I pulled over and I began to listen. I turned off the engine and the headlights just in case. The thumping kept on going, but nothing emerged from anywhere. Eventually, it stopped. I assumed whatever was making that noise was gone now, so I turned the engine back on. As soon as the headlights popped back to life, I nearly had a heart attack. A massive, gray-colored creature stepped out of the trees on my left. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. It stared at me. The thing must have been a dozen feet tall, I'm talking huge, with arms barely touching the ground. It had long bony fingers with sharp, jagged fingernails that were curled upwards. The creature's stomach was bulging, as if it had been eating a lot of food recently. Its gray skin sagged over its body like a coat that was too big for it. It had stubby little legs compared to its arms, but they still looked plenty strong enough to crush this car. The head of the creature protruded from the body on a thick neck, which was the same size of what seemed to be a head. It kind of reminded me of some deep-sea fish. Its mouth was huge, enveloping almost all of its head. The creature didn't seem to have ears, just holes like a bird. Its eyes were small in comparison to everything else, but they were probably the size of tires from the car. It bent down, and when it looked towards me, its eyes reflected the light from the headlights. It looked as if it was carrying something in its other hand, which was facing away from me. It curled its lips into a sort of smile, showing hundreds of pointy teeth. Only then did I realize that it had raggedy black hair growing from its head. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any more surreal and horrific, I swear to God, this thing spoke to me. Too crunchy. I heard its deep and muffled voice from within the car. The hand that was facing away from me then came into view. It was holding a fully grown, dead, brown horse. 3 of the tips of its fingers were penetrating it, while the thumb and pointer finger were curled around it. It began to stand back up again, and while it did this, it began to chew on the horse's head. The creature then began to cross the road. I think that's what it was doing before it saw me. It walked off into the trees, and I honestly had no idea what to do. Do you call the police in a situation like this? Do you cancel the holiday early? I did neither of those things. I tried to enjoy the rest of the holiday as much as I could, trying desperately not to show that I was worried. Everyone was asleep in the car at the time, and I have not shared this story even with my wife. It's been something I wanted to get off of my chest for a while. I feel if I tell people I know, it'll just cause them to give me those sidelong glances, make them whisper about me. Is he crazy? Well, let me know what you think it was, and if you've ever seen anything like it. It was in my room. From Anonymous Andy 2354. I'm a college student, living in a small New Mexico town. It was my last day of college classes before the weekend began. I was in one of my classrooms. People were talking about anything they had on their minds. Plans for the weekend, upcoming exams, things like that. A classmate of mine named Kate was talking about how she was going elk hunting in the mountains of Ruidoso, and she was excited to go. She started telling us that Ruidoso has a lot of Native American history and Indian reservations. My curiosity got the best of me, and I asked her, this is gonna sound weird, but have you ever seen a skinwalker out in those woods? I knew I broke a code since I've done research on them before. Just bringing them up is a big red flag. It is said that discussing a skinwalker can bring their attention to you. She told me straight up though. Yeah, they're very, very real. I've seen one before out there in the forest. I couldn't get her to go into much detail after that, and class soon started. Before I knew it, the school day was over and I was on my way home. As I got back home to do some research and homework, I propped open my window just a bit to let some fresh cold winter breeze air into my room. I soon finished my homework, took a quick shower, and closed the window before going to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. I wasn't thirsty and I didn't need to use the bathroom, but I did have a feeling of dread. I wanted to get up from my bed to look out the window to see if there was something out there, or if it was just me being paranoid for some reason. But then, the unexpected happened. There was a strange growl emanating from the side of my bed, and just by hearing that, I froze in my bed. I did not want to move. I thought to myself, I'm just dreaming. But I knew I was awake. I remember checking the time on my phone. I was completely lucid, whether I liked it or not. I began praying in my head, hoping that it would go away. I turned my head in the direction of the sound, and I saw a crouched and frail form in the corner. I saw small, beady eyes reflecting the little light that there was. Gathering my courage, I lunged to turn on the lamp light. When it came to life, the thing in the corner was gone, and the growling stopped. The following day, I realized that I'd left my window open, and earlier that day, I'd brought up skinwalkers. I can't help but feel that this may have been a warning. I am not to talk about them, lest that thing comes back and does more than growl. Hooves, a 4chan story from Anonymous. When I was 16, I went on a camping trip to the Colorado River near Blythe. We didn't use the government campsite. Instead, we decided to camp out back at the Three Fingers Lake area, which is just a series of backwaters and canals. We arrived there mid-afternoon. It was mid-September and the sun was blazing. We found a spot that was a bit secluded. We got the tent set up, and my brother and I proceeded to go out in search of wood from the nearby willow trees. While collecting wood, I came across a series of hoof prints in the mud, as well as marks of something either sleeping there or at least bedding down in the spot from time to time. I made the assumption that it was a deer or something similar. I'd seen the things along the river on other trips. We got a small fire going while we had light out. Then we set out a few fishing poles to try our luck, while my uncle worked on dinner. It was while dinner was cooking that I thought I heard something go into the far side of the canal, farther downstream. Then it came back out on our side. Whatever it was big. I turned to my brother and he didn't think anything of it. My dad thought it was a beaver. Dinner was cooked, we ate and then set out to get some night fishing in, all four of us. My dad, my brother, and uncle were focused intently upon our rods. I kept having a strange feeling that we were being watched by someone. My uncle kept telling me I'm just creeping myself out. At around midnight, we all decided to retire. We threw a few more logs on the fire so we could keep some coals burning. We then climbed into our tents for the night. I decided to sleep in my very own tent since I had one. My dad had set up his big ol' 6-man tent, so the three of them shared that. I set up my tent on a nice flat and sandy section of dirt. No rocks underneath. I had foam padding and 2 sleeping bags under me too, so I was quite comfy. As I began to drift off to sleep, I heard something crossing the canal again. Everyone else had passed out hard. I could hear them snoring by now. Already wary, I flipped onto my stomach and looked out into the dark through the little mesh opening in the tent. All I could see was some dark shape emerging from the slope of the bank. It wandered on the edge of the light. I could hear it sniffing around, too. The sound of hooves on the ground made me think it was a deer. But then its shape came just within sight to make out a form against the dark sky, Whatever it was, I now knew it was on 2 legs. I scrunched down into my tent and stopped moving. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I saw, what I was hearing. I convinced myself it was just a deer sniffing around, and that I was confused. The sounds of the thing faded away after what seemed like hours. Then I was left there, straining to hear any more noise. All I could hear was the sound of insects and the occasional bullfrog. Finally, I was able to get some sleep. I woke up after dawn and breakfast was ready. Coffee and soda was waiting for me, whichever I chose to have. I stumbled out and ate my breakfast, and I began asking everyone if they heard anything last night, but no one had. After changing, and while the heat was still at bay, I walked over to where I'd seen the creature. Numerous hoof marks littered the dirt. I followed them over to where we'd found the wood. There was clear signs something had returned to that spot. Soil had been churned up. I walked back to the campsite, trying to not think about it, and failing. We spent the day swimming in the canal, but something in the back of my mind kept telling me that whatever I saw last night was still around there. Maybe it was watching us. That evening, it was my turn to cook, so I set up some burgers to cook over the fire while everyone else was going about their business. As I was about to pull the burgers from the fire, my uncle came running from the willow patch. He started saying that there's some weird crap going on back there. I put the burgers aside, and we all followed him. Further back in the willow trees, there was what looked to be some sort of altar. It was constructed of stones from the river, and on it laid half-eaten fish and all sorts of smashed bones. Little reed-tied shapes set around it too, like little voodoo dolls made from twigs. We all made our way out, talking about how creepy that was. My dad and uncle agreed that it was probably some pagan altar or something, because it was hidden. They both agreed that it might be best that that was the last night we stayed. That night, we kept the fire big again until we went to bed. But this time I kept eyeing the way to the willow patch. As I lay there, I heard the thing cross the canal again. I could hear the hooves of it once more. It circled to the far side of the camp. Once it got to the willow trees, I lost track of it. I strained myself to hear anything for a long time. I was certain the others were doing the same. Then we heard the most horrible sound erupt from the grove. A scream like someone being murdered, but it had a braying quality to it. I was terrified. I clutched my camp shovel, knowing that something was out there. I could hear movement from the other tent. I heard my dad and uncle emerge from their tent. My dad told my brother to stay inside the tent. They both began to go to the car. I heard my dad whispering that maybe they should get the guns just in case. My father and his brother always brought pistols with them when we went camping. You never know what kind of animal or crazy might show up. They both walked off into the dark towards the willow trees. Then things were deadly silent. No insects, not even a dull breeze. Then I heard 2 gunshots, followed by another horrible gargling scream. I heard the 2 of them come running full speed back to the camp. They were screaming at us to get into the car. My brother and I came out of the tents, my dad screaming, "Get the hell in the car, now!" Both of them had their pistols in hand. They headed straight for the car. We all climbed in. My dad started the car and began hauling tail down the dirt road. I'd never seen him so panicked. He started saying that they saw something back in there. My uncle was white as a ghost, told us we'd come back for our stuff at a later time. My dad did not stop the car until we made it to Blythe. He got on his cell phone then, and he called the police. But the police thought that my father had shot a homeless man camped out at the river. We headed back in, and by the time we returned to the campsite, it was dawn. The tents were torn down and everything was tossed about. Fishing rods were torn and busted. Our camp table was in several pieces scattered about. The police scoured the area, finding the altar that we'd found before. They told us we most likely shot at some teens who were out doing their devil worshipping. There was no blood, but there were hoof prints everywhere. The police told us to clean everything up and that we should probably leave. We cleaned up the site, gathering the now mostly ruined gear. I rolled up my tent, and I felt something hit my back. Ow, I thought. I looked down to see one of the wooden figures from the altar in the willows. I looked around in time to see something receding into the reeds, followed by splashing in the canal. I quickly finished up packing, and all of us left. We haven't gone back ever since. My dad, my brother, and my uncle still talk about that day, and we all refuse to return to camp near Blythe, because there's something in there. And there you have it. 5 chilling stories to get you all spooked and ready for a whole new year. In fact, it'll be a whole new decade. So, what will the 20s hold for us? Will history repeat itself? Will the world end? Or will something great begin? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. And in the meantime, there's nothing better than gathering around this campfire and scaring the life out of each other. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you want your story featured in the show, just stop on by darkstories.org and share the tale with us. If you want to support the show, there's some links in the description. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate and help us stay afloat, cause YouTube is weird. And there's a link to my merch store, where you can get shirts that feature monsters and my slogan. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode. Fire Shard Freak says, "Please do a harpy scary story. You know, those things have always creeped me out, ever since I saw them. Well, I don't know when I first saw them. I might be wrong, but maybe it was God of War or something. But anything that looks partly human but isn't is especially creepy to me. But yeah, I don't think I've ever come across a harpy story yet, but I'd be crazy interested if anyone's seen one in real life. Hint hint, send that sucker over." Max McCune says, "Yo, bring back the old theme from the old videos." I explained in a previous video that I can't do that. As I said before, I only have a license to use those songs as long as I'm paying a subscription to that service, and I'm not going to lose every video I have if I can no longer afford that service. Does that make sense? I don't want to risk all 600 or 700 of my videos just because I think those themes were pretty cool. Now, that'll be a different story when I can actually purchase the license myself, but I think it's like $100 a track or something, so we'll see. Arnis BKS says, "My late night meal wouldn't be so good without a pinch of Darkness Prevails spooky stories. Yummy. Perfect upload timing." Yeah, I'm kind of like peanut butter mixed with hot sauce. I go good on everything. I'm gonna gag just thinking about that. Weston DeFranco says, "I just found your channel. I listen to you all day at work. Keep up the good work, buddy." Thanks so much, Weston, and I'm happy I can help the workday go by a little easier. The only time I was able to listen to anything while working, that wasn't the radio of course, was when I was self-employed cleaning cars. I was basically a hobo back then, but it was fun, and I was able to listen to the No Sleep podcast and the Paranormal podcast. Needless to say, it made me real jumpy. And Elchin L says, "You're supposed to feed that pulsating thing in your fridge. It's a great tiny friend. Right now it's attached to my hand and it's not letting go." Uh-oh. Well, that's not good, Elchin. Because when it does that, it's consuming your biomass and converting you to its mass. Pretty much, there won't be no you anymore, and it's all gonna be pulsating fridge thing from here on out. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my patrons who continue to donate. They're awesome. Happy New Year, everyone. And remember to stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.